Alright everyone, today we're going to look at the Industrial Revolution key important ideas, and this is a condensed version of AMSCO chapter 16. So let's get started. As I had mentioned in previous videos, there are several reasons or factors that help to facilitate the rise of industrial America, and those are raw materials, cheap labor, transportation networks, capital, new technology and inventions, a laissez-faire government policy, and entrepreneurs. All of those things combined help establish the United States as a world industrial power by 1900, by the turn of the century. And from the 1880s to 1900, the U.S. economy is growing 4% per year, which is phenomenal growth over a long period of time. One of the key developments of the Industrial Revolution is the expansion of the railroads. And in previous videos, I had talked about the federal government facilitating that through the Pacific Railroad Act of 1863 and various land grants. It is also the Civil War that causes the consolidation of various railroad companies and the connection of various railroad lines. So to allow for a single rail line between Chicago and New York rather than different other railroad lines and different other companies. After the Civil War, up until the 1900s, over 170 million acres of land will be given to various railroad companies. And you can see this map I have on your screen there. You can see the vast explosion of railroads that happens in just a 20-year period. Railroad companies, in turn, take their land grants and sold it in smaller pieces to private citizens for development. The effects of railroad production create faster communication and transportation of goods, facilitated by mail order catalogs, especially out west, and it creates the first sector of the economy that is controlled by monopolies. Before World War I, there was around 7 big railroad companies, and they owned 2/3 of all the railroads in the country. And the map that I have here is from the 2014, and those are the 5 big railroad companies that you can see today. At the turn of the century, there was around 7. They controlled shipping costs, and reminders, they will increasingly raise costs for farmers to transport their goods to market because they had a monopoly in that specific area, wherever that area may be. There are 4 industrial leaders that you most know. Some of these are probably most familiar to you, right? Starting on the left, we have Andrew Carnegie, who controlled the U.S. Steel Company. By 1900, the United States is outproducing Great Britain, the first industrial country in world history, the first industrialized state, and he does that through vertical integration. John D. Rockefeller, the second man from the left, controlled Standard Oil, which was established during the Civil War. And by 1881, he will control 90% of all U.S. oil production. A little bit later on, he will, at his peak, he will control around 95% of U.S. oil refineries. J.P. Morgan was a banking and later steel magnate. He will buy Carnegie's steel company and create the U.S. Steel Corporation. And Cornelius Vanderbilt began in shipping in docks, but then he transfers over to railroads and controls various railroad companies in the Northeast. All of these entrepreneurs use either vertical or horizontal integration or a combination of both. Vertical integration is owning an entire process from the beginning and the very birth of that product, like the mines in which you get the raw materials for steel, to the final cutting and shipping of the steel to build a building, for example. That's vertical integration. Horizontal integration was, the best example would be Standard Oil, owning a stage in the production process. John D. Rockefeller owned 90% of the refining in this country at one point. The U.S. government's policy of laissez-faire, which is a hand-off approach on business. There is a non-interference or a non-regulation policy. And the laissez-faire policy, which was really rooted in the ideas of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, was aided by the belief in social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was not created by Darwin. Social Darwinism is applying the theory of natural selection, which was developed by Charles Darwin, and applying natural selection to society and the market. The term social Darwinism was coined by Herbert Spencer. Only the strongest companies would survive. If a person failed to make it in the business, it's the survival of the fittest. Natural selection brought to the social arena. The federal government does attempt to limit the power of trusts. However, they are ineffective. The wording of the Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890, attempted to outlaw monopolies and attempted to ban non-competition agreements between various companies, but the language was so vague and there was no enforcement of the law that it was ineffective. It won't be until the Progressive era, that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, that the Sherman Antitrust actually had some meat behind it. The United States government issues thousands of patents during the Gilded Age, which helped to propel the Industrial Revolution. You have some famous inventions, specifically the typewriter and the telephone. They helped to create faster communication and better organization of large companies by documenting orders and products and so forth. You also have the development of advertising and marketing. Macy's Marshall Field's first developed mail order catalogs, brought new products to farmers, and refrigerated railroad cars and canning of vegetables specifically will lead to an increased standard of living and better nutrition for many, many Americans. Despite a moderate increase in the standard of living, many Americans still labored under pretty awful working conditions. The average worker during the Gilded Age worked 60 hours a week, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sundays were the only days off. The average hourly rate for an unskilled industrial worker, such as those seen there, was 10 cents an hour. Conditions vary depending on what industry you were in, but generally there was poor ventilation, heavy equipment, and no safety regulations. In 1882, an average of 675 workers were killed each week due to unsafe working conditions. There's no vacation days, there's no sick leave, there's no health insurance, there's no workers' comp, there's no pensions. If a person got hurt on the job, they either reported to work the next day or they lost their job. If they complained, they would be fired and replaced with another person who would be willing to work for a lower wage. Child labor also increases during this time period because families are not working, are working enough, but they're not getting paid enough to where they can make a meaningful wage. Child labor began as early as 5. This is not to say that all children worked. That is not true. But depending on the industry, some children worked as long as 14 hours a day. Most of those children worked in the textile industry, as you can see in the photograph. Their fingers were nimble enough to replace the bobbins on the textile machinery, so the machinery did not have to stop. As people are moving into the cities for jobs, there's problems in the workplace, and there's also problems living at home. Tenement buildings develop, and there's massive overcrowding in those buildings. Pollution, crime, all increase because of poor sanitation and the lack of fresh running water. There are various transmittable diseases that are waterborne. Jacob Riis was an investigative police reporter and photographer who documented the plight of the urban poor. These pictures are from his book, How the Other Half Lives. Workers start to collectivize and to organize individual voices. They create labor unions. Each industry had their own labor union. So if a person worked in the steel industry, there was the steel labor union. And the two big unions that you need to know during this time period are the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. The Knights of Labor were led by Terence Powderly, and Powderly accepted all workers, both skilled and unskilled, Catholics, immigrants, African American, and women. They were all allowed into the Knights of Labor. He didn't discriminate. The Knights of Labor advocated for an 8-hour workday. They wanted cooperatives. They wanted prohibition, the banning of the sale of alcohol, and they wanted to end child labor. In 1886, there is a protest that develops into a riot in the Haymarket Square in Chicago. It was not caused by the Knights of Labor after investigations, but the Knights of Labor were blamed for it. And following 1886, the Knights of Labor decline in power and they fall apart. The American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, only accepted skilled workers from individual unions. So they would accept steel workers. Children working in various textile factories were not skilled enough to be accepted into the American Federation of Labor. The AFL really argued for shorter working hours, higher wages, better working conditions, collective bargaining, which allows for the unions to negotiate with the companies for pay rates and protections on workers' rights and so forth. Both of these national organizations and individual sector unions use strikes as a way to fight for better working conditions and pay. 3 important strikes to know would be the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, because it is widespread, it is nationwide, and it is eventually put to a stop when President Cleveland orders federal troops to protect the U.S. mail. That leads to the end of the railroad strike. Haymarket, because of the use of violence and the effect that it has on the Knights of Labor. And finally, the Homestead Strike of 1892, which was against Carnegie Steel, we'll look at later on this week. Finally, the big effects of industrialization. What we see during this time period is a concentration of wealth. The 10% of the top 10% of the population will own 90% of the wealth of the country. There is also an expanding middle class. Wage earners, people who worked hourly rates, will make up 2/3 of the population. Most of them will be living at some sort of subsistence level, just making it to squeak by. All right, that's the quick effects of the Industrial Revolution. Catch you on the next video. Have a good day.